All right, welcome to part 2 of Is Truth Relative, where I will address relativism logically. Before we begin, if some of my arguments come across as a bit strident, know that they are directed at the idea of relativism, not relativists. So in part 1, I talked about how relativists give 3 lines of evidence for their belief: philosophical, historical, and moral. Starting with philosophy, the relativist demands, you believe that absolute truth exists, prove it. Now, I stated earlier that absolute truth cannot be proven because any such proof would rely on absolute truth to do so, which is circular reasoning. So this request is impossible to meet. And if it is impossible, then that makes relativism non-falsifiable, meaning that it cannot be proven false. The relativist also says that since all truths are interpreted, and our interpretations can vary, then all truths must vary and be relative. But note that this is different from denying that truth exists. Just because our interpretations of the truth vary does not mean that truth doesn't exist. So this evidence is irrelevant. As it is, this evidence would better support skepticism, which is the idea that truth does exist but is difficult to interpret. Addressing skepticism is another subject entirely. Concerning the historical evidence, relativism basically says, so many people have been wrong about truth in the past, so if history continues, which it always does, then how can you claim that your truth is absolute? This line of evidence is irrelevant because I never claimed to know what absolute truth was. All I said is that absolute truth exists. To say that truth is difficult to discern, therefore it does not exist, is fallacious. Therefore, citing historical failures as evidence for relativism does not address my argument. The same is true of the moral evidence. Relativists will say, you must be arrogant if you claim to know what absolute truth is. And again, I am not claiming to know what that truth is. All I am claiming here is that it exists. So this line of evidence is irrelevant to my argument. Therefore, the evidence that relativists provide does one of two things. It either demands the impossible in the case of philosophy, which makes their belief non-falsifiable. This is like asking someone to jump across a canyon, and when they can't do it, saying that they are unathletic. Or the evidence is irrelevant in all three cases. In this picture, the water is chemically different from the surface of the windshield, so it beads and slides off. The windshield is not affected by the water. In the same way, my argument, which is that absolute truth exists, is not affected by any of the evidence that relativists offer. These irrelevant evidences are often taken as bulletproof. Thus, many believe in relativism for reasons that have nothing to do with relativism. Here's our outline. We just showed that the evidence for relativism is insufficient. That was our first reason supporting premise 2 of our argument. The second reason is that relativism logically defeats itself, and this will be done by showing all the absolute truth claims that relativism makes. That is, if it makes absolute truth claims, then not all truths can be relative, which means that relativism is false. The first of these absolute truth claims is that absolute truth does not exist. The key point here is that the truth of this claim is said to be absolute. But if the statement that absolute truth does not exist is an absolute truth claim, then that statement defeats itself. It's like a man who sits on a tree branch and saws it off. If the man is successful, then his position on the branch has been undermined. That is, saying that there is no absolute truth is just as much of an absolute truth claim as saying that there is. It applies to all people in all situations and makes no distinction. To formally illustrate this, I wrote an argument. This statement it addresses is that the truth of truth claim number 1 is not absolute. This statement will be known as A. The rest of the argument will follow the format: if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then D, and so on. So premise 1 states that if the truth of claim number 1 was not absolute, then the truth of claim number 1 would be relative. Remember, if something's truth is not absolute, then it is relative. And premise 2 states that if the truth of claim number 1 is relative, then the truth of claim number 1 depends on the situation. Premise 3 states that if the truth of claim number 1 depends on the situation, then claim number 1 can be not true or false in some situations. To see why premises 2 and 3 are true, just remember the definition of a relative truth presented in part 1. Premise 4 states that if truth claim number 1 is false in some situations, then absolute truth exists in those situations. So claim number 1 is that absolute truth does not exist. If that claim can be false, then that means in those situations that absolute truth does exist. And if absolute truth exists in some situations, premise 5 says, then absolute truth exists in all situations. This is by definition of absolute truth. What is absolutely true for your situation must also be true in my situation. But premise 6 says that would contradict what relativism says, which is that absolute truth cannot exist in any situation, let alone all situations. This yields a conclusion, which is that the truth of claim number 1 is absolute. If this was a lot to take in, just look at the format underneath each premise and see how it logically fits together. The basic idea is if you play out the idea that the truth of claim number 1 is relative, you arrive at a situation that relativism cannot allow. By this, we know that its truth is thought to be absolute. This may sound all fine and good, logically speaking, but know that most relativists do not realize that they are making absolute truth claims, and it tends to be very hard to convince them otherwise. So in a debate, you might encounter these objections as a last-ditch effort to preserve the idea that they are not making absolute truth claims. The first of these objections sounds something like, okay, absolute truth exists for you, but for me, truth is still relative. So for some relativists, it's okay if absolute truth exists in your situation, as long as it stays in your situation and does not carry over to theirs. But this contradicts the definition of absolute truth. If absolute truth exists, then it exists for everyone, the relativist included. So it's not possible for absolute truth to exist only in my situation. The second of these objections sounds something like, okay, well, I was only 99% sure that truth claim number 1 is correct, not absolutely sure, so I never made an absolute truth claim. So I am only 99% sure that truth is relative, not 100% sure. And as long as I am not 100% sure, I do not make an absolute truth claim and can therefore avoid defeating myself. I have two answers to this. Firstly, most of those who make this objection do not believe it, which makes the objection irrelevant. Allow me to illustrate. If they are not 100% sure that absolute truth does not exist, then there is a chance that it does exist, in which case there is a chance that certain exclusive truth claims are correct. So there's a chance that the Christian is correct when he says Jesus is the only way to heaven, or there is a chance that the fundamentalist Mormon is correct when he states it is his God-given right to practice polygamy, or there is a chance that the radical Muslim is correct in believing that killing non-Muslims is a way to glorify Allah. After all, it just turns out that they are in the 1% of situations where absolute truth does exist. Do you think that given this possibility that most relativists would still be doubting the truth of claim number 1? Absolutely not. For in the relativist mind, their claim must be absolutely true in order to suppress the truth claims that offend them. So this objection is irrelevant. It also does not save relativism from making an absolute truth claim. Saying that I am 99% sure that I am correct is just as much of a truth claim as saying that I am absolutely sure. That is, we still have to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that 99 times out of 100 that relativism is true, and that it is not true the remaining one time. At the very least, the truth claim is made that relativism is a philosophy worth following, and that is an absolute truth claim in and of itself. And as long as absolute truth claims are made, relativism defeats itself. So our man on the branch still applies to relativism. It attempts to deny absolute truth, but in so doing uses absolute truth, and therefore defeats itself. I will be using this analogy many times, so just know that from this point on, the man represents relativism, the branch represents the foundational statement of relativism, which is that no absolute truth exists, and the saw represents relativism's use of absolute truth. So relativism's use of absolute truth destroys its own foundation. So absolute truth claim number 1 is that absolute truth does not exist. Absolute truth claim number 2 is that God does not exist. And by God, I mean capital G God, meaning the monotheistic God of Abrahamic religions. So why must relativism deny the existence of God? Because if he exists, then so does absolute truth. We know this from the attributes of God. Firstly, God quite literally claims to be truth. Using the Christian God as an example, in John 14:6, Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life. Moreover, the Bible claims that everything God says is absolutely true, not because there is some standard that we use to judge the truth of his statements, but because he himself is that standard. In other words, what God says is not just true, it is literally truth. This is also the case for what God does. The Bible says it is his righteous character that forms the basis for our moral values. This is why Psalm 119, 160 says, "The sum of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous rules endures forever." Now, in these videos, I am not saying that God is any of these things, or even that God exists. I am only describing what the Christian belief is. So if God is truth, and relativism denies truth, then relativism cannot allow the existence of God. If that was a little bit abstract, here is a more concrete description. Looking at some of the other attributes of God, he is spaceless, meaning that he does not exist within space. Thus, his existence does not depend on the place. God is timeless, meaning that he does not exist within time. Thus, his existence does not depend on the time. God is immaterial, meaning that he is not made of matter. Thus, his existence does not depend on the physical event that is happening. All this is to say that God's existence, if he exists, would not depend on the relative situation. That is, there is no way for God to exist only in your situation or only in my situation. If he exists, his existence would be necessarily absolute due to his attributes. And since relativism cannot have absolute truth, it cannot allow the existence of God. Now, it is interesting that relativism will tolerate the existence of polytheistic gods who do not have the attributes mentioned. These gods align more with relativism, but not so with monotheistic gods. Therefore, the Bible's claims, regardless of if they are true or not, are the equivalent of blasphemy and relativism. This is why relativism tends to be okay if you are religious, so long as you keep it to yourself. But the moment you make truth claims that are universal, then tensions arise. But that is truly ironic for a worldview that claims there is no absolute truth. Claiming that there is no God is just as much of an absolute truth claim as saying that there is one. Just as claiming that there is no truth is just as much of a truth claim as saying that there is. So our man on the branch is becoming more equipped as we go. For each truth claim that relativism makes, it adds a tool to our man's belt. So far, he has made 2 truth claims, which is like cutting himself off with a saw and an axe. Truth claim number 1 was that absolute truth does not exist. Truth claim number 2 is that God does not exist, meaning that relativism is a form of atheism with respect to monotheistic gods. The remaining 5 absolute truth claims of relativism are not inherent to relativism like the first 2 were, but they are nonetheless associated with it. The third truth claim is that man's ability to discern truth is limited. Remember how one of the main evidences that relativists cite is the number of times people have thought they have known the truth but were wrong? This claim is one of absolute truth. It applies to everyone at all times. It makes no distinction. The fourth truth claim is that it is arrogant to make an absolute truth claim. Remember how we are to believe that man is so limited, so mentally weak, so feeble that it is impossible for him to arrive at the truth? So to say that you have the truth is to say that you are smarter or wiser than everyone else, and is therefore a claim of arrogance. This too is an absolute truth claim because it applies to everyone, especially if your truth claim is about morality or religion. The fifth truth claim is that we should be inclusive to other ideas. We should be inclusive because there is no such thing as absolute right or wrong, which means that there is no inherent difference between worldviews. So who am I to say that you are wrong and that I am right? Now remember, if each person is the source of their own truth, then to deny that truth is oftentimes taken very personally. This is why this particular point is often associated with the idea that to exclude a person's worldview is to exclude the person, that to disagree with someone or say that they are wrong is the same as hating them. And this is not necessarily true. Despite this fallacy, the intensity with which this part of the relativist doctrine is promoted is perhaps more than it is for any of the others. The sixth truth claim is that we should treat all ideas equally. This is similar to, yet distinct from the third truth claim. But it arises from the same idea that there is no truth, and that there is therefore no difference between ideas. Therefore, we should not discriminate. The seventh truth claim is that we are morally obligated to obey the truth. So all of the previous six absolute truth claims that relativists make, there would be no point in making them if the truth was not binding. Allow me to illustrate. If the truth wasn't binding, I could say something like, I think what you're saying about inclusivism and God not existing is right, but you know what? Truth just doesn't apply to me. So I'll go on my merry way, making my offensive truth claims about morality, religion, and the afterlife. This is not going to fly, which shows that relativists think that the truth is binding. And the key point here is that all these truth claims are absolute, or there would be no point in making them. If they weren't absolute, there would be a possibility that the truth claims that contradict relativism would be correct, which relativism cannot allow. And for each absolute truth claim that relativism makes, it defeats itself. Relativism makes at least 7 absolute truth claims, so our man's toolbox is quite full. Here is the outline. We have finished the second reason for premise 2, which is that relativism logically defeats itself by way of its truth claims. We are nearing the end of part 2, so let's summarize what we have covered so far. Starting in part 1, I introduced relativism as the idea that all truths are relative. That proves premise 1 of our outline. Also in part 1, I showed that it is impossible to deny one form of truth and accept others. So moral relativists must deny all forms of truth. That was premise 1. Premise 2 holds that not all truths are relative. And remember, the reason I took the indirect route of proving that absolute truth exists is because it is impossible to prove it directly. Premise 2 is supported by 2 arguments, the first of which was to address the evidence for relativism. This evidence was shown to be either impossible to meet in the case of the philosophical evidence, or irrelevant in the case of all 3 forms of evidence. The second of these arguments showed that relativism logically defeats itself because it makes absolute truth claims. We looked at 7 of those truth claims, but in reality there are probably many more. The fact that the evidence for relativism is insufficient and that relativism defeats itself proves the conclusion that absolute truth exists. So in summary, relativism, which says there is no absolute truth, makes at least 7 absolute truth claims. And this does not include the claims that it often makes about politics and religion. And for every truth claim it makes, it defeats itself. There are 7 truth claims, so this is like our man on the tree cutting himself off with a handsaw, a chainsaw, a hatchet, an axe, a tomahawk, a circular saw, and a stick of dynamite. There are 2 implications of this. The first is that absolute truth exists, and this fact is affirmed by none other than the theory designed to destroy it, relativism. The second implication is that relativism is not what it appears to be. On the surface, relativism appears to not be making any truth claims, but if you dig deeper, you see that it is just like any other worldview, with its own set of truth claims that others must adhere to. So don't be deceived by appearances. That is the end of part 2, where we addressed relativism logically. In part 3, I will continue the theme of relativism not being what it appears to be by addressing it morally.